Well, thank you, Jennifer. I'm so happy to be here with Gary and to be in Sun Valley. I'm always amazed that you can go almost anywhere on the earth, into any city and immediately land and you're part of a family, an art family. And in addition to so many wonderful friends here today, unexpected people from literally my high school to my college to my adult life. It's also just wonderful to be with wonderful art people. And when I walked into Gary and Ann's home today, I felt that. It's, as Jennifer did, and she told me, she said, as soon as I walked into their house, I knew, that I would have friends here. And, gradually, I think she's found those people, of course, in this wonderful community. So it's great to be here and to be in dialogue with you, Gary. And I thought we could start. I know you want to start with me, but I'm going to start with you. Because I know people are so curious about, I guess we're meant to kind of talk about not only private collecting, but also institutional collecting. So we can get into that as we go a little bit. But maybe start with, I had so many questions about your collection, but start with the origin story, because when I walked in the door and asked, how did you start collecting, it was actually a really wonderful, it's a wonderful story about discovery.
I think you're referring to the trip to the Tetons?
I am.
Okay. In the 70s, my parents took my family and I to the Grand Tetons. And like everyone in this room, I'm sure we were completely, shocked by how gorgeous and beautiful they were, especially coming from Southern California. I hadn't seen anything like it. And I went back to Los Angeles, and I had a lunch meeting. And next door to the lunch meeting, in the window, was a picture of the Grand Tetons, a photograph. And after lunch, I walked in there, and I said, "That's the Grand Tetons." They said, "Yes." "Is that photograph available?" And they said, "Yes." I said, "Well, how much is it?" They said, $3,000. I went, "Are you out of your mind? $3,000 for a photograph?" I took plenty of photographs. I'll just live with that.
So what year was this?
This was probably 76 something, 75. I've lost track. At any rate, had another lunch there. A couple months later, the picture wasn't in the window. I walked in and said, "Did you sell that?" They said, "Yes, but we have another one." It was an addition. And by that time, I had learned who Ansel Adams was. And I said, "So how much is the photograph?" And they said, $4,000. I'm like, something's up here. And once again, left a little dejected. And our collection started a couple of years later by buying Ansel Adams' Grand Tetons in the Snake River.
For more than $4,000.
For more than $4,000. And happily, it hangs in our home here today. So it's been a long journey, and prefaced by the fact that I grew up around French Impressionist art that my grandparents collected. So it kind of, I guess there was some connection there.
And did the core of the collection start with photography?
It did.
That kind of set you going, because you have that beautiful wall of black and white photographs.
Yeah, it's kind of what we could afford at the time, and it was, at that time, it was just newly sort of viewed as a collectible, and there were editions so that you could actually study and learn about it and compare prices in galleries around the country, and it was also, there was just such a vast amount of photography. You could really formulate a narrative. And so our narrative started with the Ansel Adams and was the natural world, pretty much. Not a lot of urban stuff, but nature and landscapes and those kinds of things.
Right. And then you showed me the first painting that you bought together, which you were laughing because it was so expensive for you at the time, which reminded me of my first painting that I bought in graduate school, which I paid off over 10 years or something.
Which was?
I don't even remember the artist. It was a Texas artist, and I walked into a gallery in San Francisco, and it was huge. It was like 6 by 6 feet or 5 feet, some
Wow.
Crazy thing for $5,000. And and it lived in my graduate school bed, the house I was sharing with roommates. It was totally insane. But
Yeah, well, we do that.
But you bought a painting, and that was the beginning of moving into other media?
It was, and it was also the first thing we bought together, and it still hangs in our home. And yeah, it was the first painting and kind of kicked it off. We were probably really slow at the beginning. We had daughters to raise and businesses to build and not a lot of extra money. And the extra money we used to come here and, build a home here. So it took a while. Had a slow start.
Yeah. And so I guess at this point, the question that interests me always is how, as a couple, you do it. And you told me a little bit about that today, but it's both of you together, but I think Anne has veto powers.
Total veto power. Yeah.
Right?
Doesn't exercise it that often, thankfully. But yeah, we share the whole experience together and talk about the stories behind everything, and we live it basically.
Yeah.
So it's fun to do together.
You do all the research.
And you mentioned, because I'm sure people in the room who may be collecting or thinking about it or dabbling in it or committed to it, the relationship with initially your consultant. You talked about first going with a consultant and that was not...
Well, we dabbled for many, many years in photography and then, art, Aboriginal art, Haitian art,
Right.
folk art, and we were just kind of wandering, and the contemporary art had become a very important part of the contemporary music business at that point. Music artists were discovering visual artists, and they were incorporating them in their album covers and Talking Heads and REM, and so started to get a sense that there was a whole other world going on out there, and wanted to know it, but I didn't know how to even find out about it, really. And so we hired an art consultant recommended by a friend, and I just said, let's jump in and make us uncomfortable, throw stuff at us, we'll buy it, we'll live with it, and we'll figure this out. And we made enormous mistakes and bought a lot of stuff we didn't ultimately like, have since sold it all, but it got us on that path. Mm-hmm. And it was, I wouldn't recommend that approach for everybody, but it certainly worked for us, but total immersion and trust, neither of which worked that well, but it got us where we are, so. Yeah. And this is now 16 years later, and after a short time, we started to figure out you don't buy names, you buy art, and other people's taste doesn't necessarily apply to you, and so we started to formulate our own point of view.
Right. I love that you talk about being uncomfortable. I think that's so important, right? When you lose that desire and that feeling, then it's probably done. But I think that the collection, from what I saw today, has so many different threads, and you mentioned that there are kind of several different areas that you are focusing on, but when you walk in first, it's actually not the photography that you're talking about or the more historical paintings, it's actually really emerging art.
Yeah.
And so tell me about how you got to that, because that's a long way from Ansel Adams.
Yeah. Once you start to take it all in and you get some perspective, you begin to see what people are making. You get curious about what people are making today and what inspires them. And we've found a lot of artists who are making work today that inspired us and got us excited. And the things that they're expressing were things that we wanted to live with and express through their work. And that led us to very contemporary work. But that is a very fluid process for us. In other words, we'll buy a contemporary piece, we'll live with it for a while, and if we don't end up loving it, we'll sell it and move on. So what you saw today was kind of for lack of a better term, a curation of a lot of contemporary artists that we bought over the last 10 years, narrowed down to, 10. So it's all part of that exploration and discovery process that makes collecting probably anything exciting. What's next? What's new? Can I live with that? Does that say something I want to say? Will that make me feel this way tomorrow that it makes me feel today? So, and with the more historical pieces, there's just so much history and background behind all of them that when you make, and also a higher level of entry, that when you make that acquisition, you're kind of prepared and you know what you're going to feel. But when you take in something that's brand new and emerging, it's a whole other experience.
Yeah. You talked about some of the paintings in that front gallery that is curated, as you say, Hugh Hayden, Ilana Safdie, Christina Quarles, Batala Madani was somewhere else, but Nathaniel Mary Quinn. I mean, these are some of the leading artists working in a figurative mode at the moment. They're really, it's really adventurous. You don't know, Hugh Hayden I haven't actually seen in a home in Los Angeles. I'm sure he's there, but these are really young artists, and you described it, I think, as being, what did you say? Sort of not stories of migration, stories of translation, maybe?
Stories of isolation, migration and being separated from home. A lot of these are international artists, not Mary Quinn, but there's a Colombian artist, there's a Haitian artist, and all of these artists have come to America to work. And, I guess as a foreigner, they probably are sensing a longing for home and the comfort of home, but they want to be here, and so that's expressed in their art. And some of them are doing better than others, in assimilating here. So
that's something a theme that emerged for you you just were attracted to that kind of work that was involved in that sort of thematic, you think?
I wished I knew the answer. I think it sort of happened that we had a lot of art that was inspired by that, and then we decided to put it all together in that space, and it really felt good.
It really worked.
And it's also, kind of like Haitian art. It's, one of the poorest nations on the planet, and lifestyle there's not very good, but their art is joyous. And so a lot of that art is very colorful and very bold, and so that's also part of what attracted us to it, is the joy in it, despite what these people are going through. And they belong together, I think.
Yeah, no, they work beautifully together, I think.
Thanks.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the folk art, because I think it's really, so in the house, we went into your closet, actually, and there were two really good Grandma Moses paintings that I think came from your family, right? That you bought back, and it's really unusual, I think, for somebody to be so involved with, cutting-edge contemporary art, and also to be comfortable and conversant in, so-called outsider art or folk art. Talk a little bit about that, because you also have, there was Martin Ramirez, that beautiful drawing that you kind of recently bought, I think, and Joseph Yoakum is in one corner, and you have a fair amount of it.
Well, Ann and I collected a bunch of it, 20, 25 years ago, and it found a place in our collection, and it's very much a part of who we are, and that, it's true, I think, in the work of some of the other artists we collect, Kusama, this naive and this whimsy that attracts, it's magic in our minds, and these self-taught artists or outsider artists expressing these emotions and these feelings and in a very untrained way, and it's part of what we love about it, and it ties in as well to the music business and the music, which is very much a part of our lives. And so I look at the collection more as almost like a collection of songs, and they're just visual songs. And songwriting and music making is that way. So the folk art, and it wasn't, and also a lot of artists that we love chose folk art for their album covers. So, the Talking Heads and REM as mentioned, and many others. And so that kind of made that connection in our heads years ago. And we've just continued to follow that thread. And Martin Ramirez, for instance, was someone we didn't buy back in the day and had been wanting to add for many, many years until we found that piece that you saw today. So that was something we had longed for a long time.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece. I mean, I said when we saw it, when I was at the Museum of Modern Art, I mean, and this is one, maybe puts into relief one of the differences between personal collecting and institutional collecting. What you can do very easily as a private person, when I was at MoMA, there was a history there of, there is some folk art in the collection which had almost never been shown. It was sort of languishing in storage. And when I was there, as head of the drawings department, I bought a Martin Ramirez, and it was the first purchase of a work of a folk artist, of an outsider artist in contemporary time. And it was a big, like a big radical move. And I thought, well, you can't actually talk about the span of contemporary art practice without also talking about self-taught artists.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in that.
That's great. That's
Yeah.
great. Well, maybe it's my turn to ask you some questions.
Okay.
You're about to make a big move. What precipitated that, and what do you hope to do there? Maybe tell us about this difference between where you are and where you're going, too.
Yeah. I'm thinking of my son who's here, who's probably hearing this for the first time. The reason, in a certain way, at least from the art perspective. So I've been at the Hammer Museum for 10 years. It's a museum that really does have, as part of its core mission, emerging art and tracking emerging artists. It's a lot of what we show. It's a lot of what we buy for the collection. There's a lot of it up now in the museum, in case you're in Los Angeles. And I've had a wonderful run there. I've always believed that it's really good for these kinds of institutions to have a change in, especially curatorial leadership. I think change is good. You shouldn't have one point of view that is forming everything. Not that mine does. I have colleagues, but I do think change is good. And the museum world, one can say a lot about what it's going through at the moment, along with the humanities and a lot of other fields. But so the whole question of leadership, of museum leadership, really interests me a lot. I mean, Jennifer, who is a gem, and you're also lucky to have her here, and she's already doing great things. But I think, she too, you kind of wait for the right moment, and for me, the right institution, and it's always been about a kind of chemistry with a place. There really are very few places I would want to have a leadership role. And MoMA PS1 is one of them. And it's a complicated, because it's an affiliate of the Museum of Modern Art, but it's the kind of, what do we want to say? It's this is like the first time I'm saying any of this in public. So it's the kid on the block. It's the kid over in Queens that's wanting to do the radical work and kind of poke at the big institution on 53rd Street in a certain way. So it's a fantastic partner for MoMA, but it's also where a lot of the emerging art happens first, and a lot of artists who then are collected by MoMA show at MoMA PS1 first, and so on. So it's a very interesting relationship between the two institutions, and that, because I know MoMA and having worked there before, I knew I could navigate that. But mostly I still really believe that I don't know, in the complicated time we're in, I still return to art as the place where one can actually put something into the world and put ideas into the world, and by supporting the work of especially lesser known or emerging artists internationally, still really excites me, and I think there's lots to do,
Yeah.
And that place is a really important part of the New York ecosystem. Somebody, a dealer in New York, said to me recently, he's like, if things aren't right at MoMA PS1, nothing's right in New York. And I thought, like, oh my God, no pressure, right? But we're all coming out of COVID. These institutions need something. They need new energy. So I hope that's what I can bring.
And how do you discover new emerging artists? And what's your process of discovery?
Yeah, well, I've always put a big value on keeping the kind of muscle of going to studios a lot and just looking, and I think it is a muscle, you must feel that too. You know, that the more you look, the more you learn, the more you can look and learn. And so that's really important to me. I listen to artists. I think the only way to actually stay, for what I do, to stay current is actually to stay deeply embedded with artists and to, you know, have them as your interlocutors, to have them as your friends, have them, you know, to constantly be talking about art with them.
Yeah.
And so that's, also MoMA PS1 is a place that is still really embedded with the art community and with artists. So that's how I try to stay current, recognizing that, you know, I have to listen to my younger colleagues a lot because art is changing. You know, what's interesting is changing, and I learn a lot from my younger colleagues and listen to them a lot too.
Yeah.
And it's important to do that, I think.
Yeah. So when you're imagining a show, I know this is too general a question, but maybe you can answer it. What goes into deciding, with all the endless possibilities, what you're going to say and how you're going to say it? What is your process of coming to that conclusion? Because obviously you're doing it for public view and for public consumption, so you've got a lot to deal with there. Versus someone like us, we have nothing.
You do it for yourself.
We do it completely selfishly for no one but ourselves. So.
But I think what you say about joy and discomfort are both really key things, and I use those metrics a lot too. But I think with a public-facing role, the whole question of timing is super interesting to me, and maybe I'm sure there's something analogous in what you do in the music business. You know, what is going to make something a work of art or a practice of an artist or an idea for a show? What is going to make it current? And hitting that spot on is so difficult to do, right? It's like, I mean, I've been doing it a long time, so have you. Maybe we're a little bit good at it, but it's like, what is urgent? What do people want to see? And for me, my first public is artists. Like, if I can hit on an idea that is something that artists feel is urgent and a show that they want to see, then I know it's going to be, the timing of it will be right. And, you know, like with the feminist project that Jennifer mentioned, it was mounted in the lead up to the, I forget which election, but anyway, that's another thing. But so the question of timing is really an interesting one to me. I think, but I am also very aware that what I'm obsessed with, you know, you have to make sure that you're on the right side of it and you're not aging out in some way too. Again, I don't know. I think.
Well, I think you bring up a point. Like, how do you separate your own personal taste from that of being a curator?
You have to.
Yeah. So you do.
I think you have to as a curator. I think it's not responsible. You can't only go with your own personal taste. I mean, you have to somehow be thinking about the institution and the audiences, very much who comes to your museum, who do you want to come to your museum? I think a lot of it is aspirational thinking too. I mean, if you want a more diverse audience, what is on your walls has to be more diverse. People have to see themselves in the art in your museum. So I think you have to do both. You have to always, I mean, I follow my own personal taste, but I always test it against all of those other things. And of course, a museum has a responsibility to represent a certain history, which you don't at all. You don't have to do anything like that if you don't want to. But you also mentioned having a list, a sort of wish list of artists, which we do too. We work with lots of wish lists. You know, in our case, it's a breakdown of like, these are the emerging artists who we want to follow, these are the mid-career, these are the historical figures that we want to have represented in the collection. You know, at the Hammer, what are the histories we want to represent? We're trying to really build a collection that tracks LA art over time, since 1960 if we can, which is a tall order. But it's fun because at the Hammer, I've enjoyed the collecting because it's a new collection. So you can kind of do anything. I mean, I remember when I was at MoMA before, the conversations were they were about emerging art often, but they were also about like which, Cézanne drawing is less good, and you're going to de-accession to buy the better Cézanne. It was just like crazy because it's all amazing what's in that collection. So, but the refinement of the de-accessioning, so that was a whole other thing that was more historically based, I guess. But yeah, institutionally, you have to always be putting on these other frames, I think, to test against. I mean, are there enough women? I'm very happy about the fact that in the last 10 years since I've been there, the percentages of women artists and artists of color have completely shifted so that we're fully more or less half-half at this point, which wasn't true 10 years ago. So all of those things, I think, come into play.
Do you think going forward, art history will be an important element in what you decide to display and show? Because I'm seeing a huge generational shift going on in the collecting world and in the emerging art world. It's bringing all these new collectors into it, in part due to social media, and just the globalization of the art market, and speculation too. And I just wonder personally, we're collecting. We just bought a piece of art that was made in 1951, before I was born. And you just wonder whether our children's generation will have any interest in that in 10 years as we boomers age out, which is happening in the next 5, 6, 7 years. We're kind of done as a generation, and how much of that is going to carry over? So my question is, when you are presenting emerging artists, how much do you try to make those bridges and connections to the inspiration behind them, to the extent there is any?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I'm really conscious all the time of the fact that most of the artists on the emerging front, as well as younger colleagues, have not seen what I've seen in terms of exhibitions. So even shows that I've organized that, like this feminist one, which was in 2006, they haven't even seen those shows. So all the stuff that goes into my frame of reference and the decisions that I make, they haven't seen. So what do I want to say? I mean, I always think historically because I'm really interested in art history and really the recent past. I mean, let's say, which to me is 1960 or something, that's contemporary art. And so I'm always thinking about or looking at the contemporary work with a historical lens. So, and I try to encourage my younger colleagues to do the same, so that when you're writing about something, you don't just describe it in terms of the here and now. You also try to anchor it within a context, a cultural context, but also a historical one. Yeah. And I think it's really important. But I was thinking the other day, I have an opportunity to make a show in New York in like a year, which is terrifying. And so I've been trying to think about, what's going to be, like, how can I, no pressure, but I was thinking maybe something about the 90s, which is actually for me a huge sweet spot. That's my generation, but that's art history at this point. That's history.
I guess it is.
And that's like, is there a way to say something about emerging artists in the early 1990s that would point to a much less conservative moment than we're currently in? I mean, I have a big rant about, the focus on painting right now in the art world, which is fine, but part of it is that there's an incredibly conservative turn in the art world right now, I think, coming out of COVID and whatnot. So how can you point back to a time when there was much more experimentation happening around the edges and at the center too? So, and to me, if you go back, however many years that is, 35, I don't know how long ago that is, longer maybe, but is there a way to look at that art history of the just past, look at it historically, but as a way to kind of comment on the present? I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. No, it does. Anyway, yeah, it does.
You were talking about, again, thinking about the historical and kind of the concurrent emerging artist thing, you were talking about artists who were kind of on your wish list in a way. And how do you think about that? I mean, you spoke about recent major purchases of Rauschenberg and Ruchet.
Yeah.
And, and then also the emerging art. How do you, I mean, do you also have a running list of emerging artists, or is that much more of a sort of organic process of looking and one leads to another and so on?
Well, that raises a whole other topic in a sense. The emerging art world is so out of control, and the demand is so massive that you have to have a wish list, because you just can't pick up the phone and call a gallery, no matter how much business you've done with them, and say, oh, I'd like a Christina Quarles.
Yeah.
You know, they go,
get in line.
Get in line, yeah.
Right.
So you do have to have a wish list, and you have to wait, and you have to be patient, and oftentimes you have to buy them on the secondary market because the demand is just way beyond the supply.
Right.
So went through a period of a decade where the wish list was deep and intense, and the pursuit was, very aggressive. And we just kind of got so much of it now, we kind of just backed off. And I'm not sure, art happens just like in music in spurts. There are movements, And there would seem to have been a movement over the last decade where there was just so much great emerging art. And it became such a thing, such a trend, and it became so speculative that so many people entered the market, and I think artists started to create product, and the galleries were pushing them to create more product.
Yeah.
That it is, I don't find it that inspirational at the moment. Mm-hmm. This too shall pass, but there was a period there, and it was a lot easier to get that art. Mm-hmm. The Christina Quarles that we talked about today, and you saw, we bought that in her first show in LA. Nobody knew who she was or cared.
Yeah.
And today, it's out of control.
Yeah.
So we're not in that as much today as we were. Mm-hmm. I think I've lost my point, but...
well, just wondering if you have sort of a running list of who you're interested in right now. Is there a particular person or kind of work, or...
The Alana Saldi, you saw her, and this is another thing that Ann and I do. We'll get in where we can on an artist. Mm-hmm. We'll live with it for a while, get to know it. It's one thing to read about it or even see it, but to live with it is a whole other experience. And once you start to determine what you feel about it, and if it's an artist who's been creating work for a long time, what specific part of their body of work is appealing to you. Mm-hmm. And so we have this Alana Saldi, and her work is extremely difficult to get. Yeah. And we like the piece we have, but I think it's a starter piece. I think it will lead to a better piece. Yeah. And so we're on a list.
Yes, you are.
And we'll be on that list for a while. And it's also, you mentioned earlier today, buy two, give one, donate one, and keep one. That's a whole new trend going on. And she's on that in that world for the moment. Yeah. But it's so trendy right now. Our interest in her will not change, but it might not be as in demand in 5 years or whatever, and you won't have to go through that.
We have a great painting of hers on the walls now at the Hammer.
Oh, good.
Yeah, a really good one that came from a collector in San Francisco, Kamal Shah, who I think did a buy one, give one deal, but we were able to, in that case, because of her generosity, control that conversation, so I got to pick the piece.
Nice.
And then she totally exploded, and it would be impossible for us to probably get one right at the moment. But that happened so fast, her ascension. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And
but she's one of the few, right now that I would pursue.
Yeah.
Trying to think if there's others. I don't know. We've just been through two big acquisitions, so we're kind of reeling from that. We never expected that to happen back to back, but when lightning strikes, it does.
Right.
So.
Shall I open it up for questions, maybe? We can keep going, but happy to take a question. Yeah.
For your
talking a lot about collecting institutions and collecting, and what do you feel about moving to PS1 that is a non-collecting institution?
I was just thinking, as Gary was talking, one of the things I will not miss is the buy one, give one thing. Because it's such a symptom of an art world just on steroids and completely out of control, I think. I mean, for people who maybe don't know that shorthand isn't familiar, so for an artist, a hot artist like the one we're talking about, Alona Softy, who's based in New York, she just is about to have a show, or maybe just opened at White Cube in London. But what happens is these galleries, and galleries of all stripes do this now, particularly around emerging art, they will, if you're a collector, you say you want one, they will say the only way we can give you one is if you also buy one and give it to a museum. So if the piece is $100,000, you have to spend another $100,000 to give a piece to a museum. But what happens on our end, and we've benefited a lot from that generosity for sure. I mean, we have limited acquisition funds, but what does happen is we get cold calls from galleries we've never dealt with, offering work by artists we've never heard of, from collectors who we have no connection with. So it's kind of wild. Like you know, and I'm always saying, I've gotten to the point where I feel pretty good about just putting the brakes on and saying, like, I'm going to go look at the art in person, I'm going to go to the studio, I'm going to get to know what this work is, and no, we're not going to actually jump in right now. And so we turn a lot of it down, but we also benefit from a lot, like the Softy painting. So, but it's typical, it's just, the art world is making up its own rules and its own practices, and this is one of them that puts institutions in a very strange position. And there are a lot of museums where the only way I think they can acquire work is through deals like this. So they kind of have to say yes, and then you get these cookie-cutter collections that are not interesting, and most of the work, you know, years from now we won't be interested in, I think.
Yeah, it's disposable.
It's disposable. So I guess I will miss that. I mean, I love working with a collection, but I'm also, I'm kind of cool to be in a different part of the art world at the moment. It's okay.
I mean, is it more freeing in a way?
Well, I think so. I mean, I know that, you know, in my side of the field, people think they're kind of exhibition makers and collection makers. And I've always thought of myself actually as more of an exhibition maker. That's what I really love to do. And I think of it as education, and that's what I'm really great at, I think. You know, the collection thing is really interesting, but it's, I don't mind backing off of it for a minute. Yeah, here and then here.
How do you deaccession your...
Be nice, Jeff.
How do you go about deaccessioning a private collection? I've never been able to. I have never sold a piece of it.
Well, just as the path to acquiring it is unique for each piece, you know, is it acquired privately? Is it acquired through an advisor? Is it acquired through an auction, through a gallery? The process of selling it is equally as unique. So oftentimes you'll go to the gallery who represents the artist, for instance, and they have a great list of collectors who collect that artist, or people who are on that waiting list seeking that artist. The same thing with the auction houses. All the underbidders of a particular artist, they have record of everyone that bid on every piece of art that they've ever auctioned. And so if you have an artist that has been at auction, and you then have a whole list of underbidders. So it really depends on which artist, where they are in their career, where the demand is, so forth and so on. And so we do sell a lot of art, but not because we're dealers or it's our business or speculation. It's just to make room for something else and to keep refining the collection. So you sort of develop a strategy for selling each piece when it's time.
And it sounds as though the times that you've sold, it's usually from artists you have in some depth too.
Yes, when we find something we love, we kind of obsess on it, and buy a number of works, not always, but oftentimes, and then we're able to prune and then decide, well, this piece is really special to us, so we're going to sell the others and make room for the next one. Yeah. So, but if, you know, again, if you're buying it from a gallery and it's a new work, you're sort of obligated morally and ethically, and if you want the relationship with the gallery, to go back to that gallery and offer it back to them. That's the way you build relationships in the art world. And as we were talking about art in demand, those relationships are critical. If they know who you are and and they know you're not going to flip it and you're going to bring it back to them if you want to sell it, then they're more inclined to sell you something else down the road. So there's that. When you're dealing with older artists or secondary purchases, then you're free to do whatever you want.
Yeah, it's the living artists you have to be really...
Very careful, yeah.
I mean, we can't do it at all, actually.
Right.
With living artists.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, here.
Well, Jeff, thanks for asking that question, because sell is a four-letter word, not my vocabulary. So it's good to hear how you sell it. So as a collector, and you collected over many years and you create this body of work, now, what do you want to do with it at the end of the day? Where does it go? Does it go to your families? Does it go to museums, institutions? How do you and Anne discuss that and look at that issue?
Well, it's in a way a very personal question, which I'm happy to answer, because I grew up around this French Impressionist collection as a child, all of which is gone. My parents collected, all of that is gone. And it's kind of painful, because I grew up around some of this stuff and have sentimental attachment to it, and because we're art lovers, and we attach sentiment to those things. So in our case, we've established a family trust, and many of the things that we own are in that trust. So they will go to our daughters sitting there, and when we're no longer able to see art, they will decide what to do with it. We're kicking it down the road, but we're giving them the option, which I was not given. And so that became a motivating force in it. And so our collecting is estate planning as well. So.
Are there any other questions? Jennifer?
I don't want to put you on the spot, Gary, but obviously you're a lender. We have several other lenders in the audience, and again, it's so great that you decided to share your gems with all of us. But if you're comfortable, might there be a story or something you might, if you're willing to share, one of your works? Is there a story you'd love to share?
About something here in this show? I don't know. Let's see. Well, the Ken Price pieces are just so animated and fun. Maybe not as much of a story behind them as there is the attraction to them. Ken Price, whose sculptures or those clay ceramic pieces are over there, and some of his works on paper up against the wall there come out of our collection. It's probably the artist we have the most of. We have 25 something Ken Price pieces in our collection. You know, he was a surfer in Venice, California, in the 60s. So we have that sort of, you know, that's his background. Everything he does is very biomorphic, and those pieces are perfect representations of that. We're very much attached to nature, coral reefs to Smoky Mountains. And so we have a great affinity toward how he interprets those natural places, both on paper and in ceramics. So I think that's how that came to pass. And I think it's also a thread that I think kind of runs through the collection, which is this attachment to place. So for instance, art that we had in our LA home that we sold in 2019, we all brought it up here, and much of it's gone because it just didn't feel right here. Ken Price feels great here. So I think if that's kind of a story. The Cecily Brown, we were in love with Cecily Brown, and her work was really hard to get, but there was an art fair in Chicago, and I wasn't there, but we got a phone call saying, there's a Cecily Brown here in Chicago. Send me a picture. And they sent us a picture, and we'll buy it, because we just couldn't, but it was just under the radar. So we ended up, like 8-9 years ago with Blue Vox. So sometimes it's just hidden gems that you find in unlikely places.
The story you told me today about Nathaniel Mary Quinn and that connection to music was really beautiful too, I thought.
It's a fun story. Nathaniel Mary Quinn, for those of you who don't know, his story is amazing. Go on to YouTube, type in Nathaniel Mary Quinn, and listen to him talk about his life. And it's a really insightful piece into artistry and how art can save your life, in his case. And he created a show in Los Angeles, and it was all based on songs. And of course, we weren't interested in. By the way, we have no musical art in our house. There is no pictures of Jimi Hendrix or any of that stuff, because we have enough of that in our life, so we want something else in our art. But this particular piece was called A Song for You. And I won't bother trying to describe Nathaniel Mary Quinn's art because it's so unique. And I went and saw the show, and we were flipped and saw the name of the song. And it's one of my favorite songs of all time. And very little in our collection is attached to music, as I said. Although it's all the same. It's all music, but not literal. And so we wanted that piece. And when we met Nathaniel Mary Quinn a couple of years later, we talked about the piece, and he says, I named the artist earlier today. It's a R&B singer. His name will come to me in a minute, that you all know. Anyway, he says, I love that song. It's by so-and-so. And I go, that is so funny. Leon Russell wrote that song, and we came in contact with it back in the 70s on his very first album, and it's one of our favorite songs. And it's funny, he came at it from a very different direction. He didn't even know who Leon Russell was. So, Donny Hathaway, sorry. It was Donny Hathaway recorded that song, he covered it. And so his relationship to the song was Donny Hathaway. Ours was Leon Russell, but it came together in his piece of art, which is hanging in our home. Yeah.
It also shows, I think, how you like, which is not true of all collectors by any means, that you enjoy the dialogue with the artists when it happens. When you get to know them, and that must come from your experience with music artists as well. Yeah, I love talking to artists. People who create, I'm in awe of them, and it's fascinating to talk to them. He in particular, and again, I urge you to go on and look at his YouTube piece, because this guy tells his story, which is like mind-blowing, and then sits at a table, and on camera while he's talking starts drawing with both hands, and it's incredible. This guy's, and that's again one of the magical parts of collecting, as you say, is looking into, whether you meet them or you just have to read about them or look at their YouTube videos. It's the mind of the creative person is spectacular. Yeah. So, yeah. Maybe that's a closer. To end right there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I know. I don't know why I can't.